There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the very axis upon which your world tilts. They are never announced with trumpets or a sudden, cinematic downpour. They are quiet. They are the space between two breaths, the flicker of an eyelid, the almost imperceptible shift of weight on a well-worn couch cushion. For me, that moment smelled faintly of the fabric softener I used and the clean, tired scent of Julian's skin. It was just after midnight, the city outside my apartment window a distant, humming thing, and the only light in the room came from the rolling credits of a film neither of us had truly been watching for the last hour. The real story was unfolding here, in the dim glow, in the space that was shrinking between us with an excruciating, beautiful slowness. He had been, for all intents and purposes, asleep for the better part of an hour, or at least, he had been performing a convincing rendition of it. His breathing had deepened into a steady, rhythmic cadence that I had long ago memorized, a sound as familiar to me as the click of my own camera shutter. His head had lolled against the back of the sofa, dark hair falling over his forehead, his long frame folded into the corner of the cushions. I had been watching him from the corner of my eye, a practice I had honed into a secret art form over the years of our friendship. I was a photographer by trade and by nature. Observation was my native language. I could chart the cartography of Julian's moods by the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the speed at which he tapped his fingers against his thigh. But this was different. This was a new and terrifying territory. He moved. It was a minute adjustment, the kind of unconscious shifting a person does in sleep to find a more comfortable position. A rustle of his worn gray sweatshirt, a soft sigh that seemed to catch in his throat. He slid, inch by painstaking inch, across the small expanse of neutral territory between us. I held my breath, my entire being a study in stillness. My own body had become a finely tuned instrument of reception, every nerve ending alive and screaming. I felt the warmth of him long before he made contact, a radiating heat that promised both solace and devastation. I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen, on the meaningless names of gaffers and best boys scrolling into oblivion. To look at him would be to shatter the delicate fiction of his sleep. To look at him would be to admit that I was not merely a passive observer, but an active, waiting participant in this silent, unfolding drama. Then it happened. The final, closing inch was bridged. The side of his head, heavy with exhaustion, came to rest against my shoulder. It was not a collision. It was a settling, like dust motes finally coming to rest in a beam of afternoon light. The weight was immediate and profound. It felt like an anchor, grounding me in a reality I had only ever allowed myself to visit in the most secret, deep of the night daydreams. My shoulder, my arm, my entire left side was suddenly no longer my own. It was his. The muscles in my neck and back seized, a panicked, involuntary reaction. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't let him know you are awake to this. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, panicked bird beating its wings against a cage. I was certain he must feel it, that the frantic rhythm would travel through my bones and into his skull, betraying the placid facade I was so desperately trying to maintain. But his breathing remained even, a slow and steady tide washing against the shore of my collarbone. And so I sat there, a living statue, under the impossible, wonderful, terrifying weight of his trust, or his exhaustion, or whatever it was that had brought him here, to me. I was a darkroom, holding a precious, undeveloped image, terrified that the slightest intrusion of light would ruin it forever. Our friendship hadn't begun in silence. It had begun with a reluctant partnership in a sophomore-level literature class, a universe away from this quiet apartment. I was Leo, the lanky, quiet art student who lived behind the lens of a 35mm camera, more comfortable with f-stops and developing times than with actual human interaction. He was Julian, the sunbright star of the university's soccer team, a person who seemed to move through the world with an effortless grace and a magnetism that drew people into his orbit like satellites. We were, by all appearances, beings from different planets, forced into a shared trajectory by the arbitrary will of a professor who believed in pairing opposites. Our assignment was to create a multimedia presentation on the concept of liminal spaces in contemporary fiction. I was to provide the photography, he the analysis. I had dreaded it. I imagined him to be all bluster and athletic arrogance, someone who would see my quiet dedication as strange, my art as a frivolous elective. I was wrong, of course. The first time we met to work, he'd shown up at the campus library with 2 coffees and an apologetic smile, running a hand through his perpetually messy hair. He confessed immediately that he was completely lost, that the novels had gone over his head, and that he was relying on me to make him look like he had a single coherent thought. There was no arrogance, only a disarming, sheepish honesty that caught me off guard. I found myself explaining the concept to him not as an academic theory, but as a feeling. I talked about doorways, about dusk and dawn, about the moment after you ask a question but before you get the answer. I talked about the waiting rooms of life. He didn't mock me. He just listened, his brown eyes focused and serious. And then he said, "Okay, I get that. It's like the moment before the whistle blows." And just like that, a bridge was built between our 2 worlds, constructed from the unlikely materials of literary theory and sports metaphors. He became fascinated by my process. He started following me on my photographic expeditions around the decaying industrial edges of the city, watching as I waited for hours for the light to be just right. He'd sit quietly, a few feet away, doing his own reading, but I was always aware of his presence. It wasn't distracting, it was grounding. He never rushed me. He seemed to understand, intuitively, the patience my work required. In return, I started going to his games. At first, it was an obligation, a reciprocal gesture of support. I didn't understand the rules of soccer, and I didn't particularly care to. My focus was never on the ball. It was on him. I watched the way he moved, a fluid, powerful line against the green field. I watched the fierce concentration on his face, the way he communicated with his teammates through glances and gestures, a silent language I found far more compelling than the roar of the crowd. I was not watching a game. I was doing a character study. It was during one of those late autumn afternoons, the air crisp and smelling of impending rain, that the foundation of our friendship settled into something deeper, something I would have to hide. I was on the sidelines, my camera to my eye, the long telephoto lens bringing him impossibly close. He had just scored, a beautiful, arcing shot that had left the opposing goalie stunned. The crowd erupted, but I was deaf to it. In the viewfinder, I saw him turn, a wide, unrestrained smile breaking across his face. He wasn't looking at the stands, or at his celebrating teammates. For a split second, his eyes found me, found my lens. And in that fraction of a second, the smile changed. It softened, became something quieter, something private, something meant only for me. I pressed the shutter. Click. The sound was like a key turning in a lock deep inside my chest. Later that night, in the red-lit sanctuary of the campus darkroom, I watched his face emerge from the chemical bath, floating up through the developer like a ghost. The joy in his expression was so pure, so unguarded, it made my own heart ache with a feeling I was terrified to name. It was love. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow development, an image that had been latent for months, finally revealing its true form in the gentle alchemy of the dark. I hid the print. I hid the feeling. Our friendship was a rare and precious thing, a delicate ecosystem I could not bear to disrupt. He was the sturdy, sunlit oak. I was the quiet ivy that grew in its shade. To confess my feelings would be to risk poisoning the soil from which we both drew strength. The potential gain was a distant, shimmering mirage, but the potential loss was a catastrophic, world-ending certainty. So I packed the feeling away in a light-proof box in the back of my mind and contented myself with the gift of his friendship. He would talk to me about the girls he was dating, a string of bright, temporary flames that never seemed to last. He'd describe his frustrations and his triumphs, and I would listen, offering the steady, non-judgmental counsel that had become my designated role. I was his safe harbor, his quiet room. I told myself it was enough. For years, it was. I built a fortress of platonic affection around my heart, and I learned to live within its walls, content to watch the world, and him, through a carefully guarded opening. I became an expert in the art of being close, but not too close, of caring, but not showing how much. The space between us was sacred, a territory I policed with the vigilance of a border guard, because I knew that if I ever let myself cross it, I might never find my way back. The shift, when it came, was not a tremor but an earthquake. It happened years after college, long after we'd settled into the patterns of our adult lives. I had a small but functional photography studio and an apartment that was more darkroom than living space. Julian had climbed the corporate ladder with dizzying speed, becoming a software consultant whose job kept him in a perpetual state of transit. He lived out of a suitcase, chasing deals in different cities, his life a blur of airports, hotel rooms, and conference calls. The foundation of our friendship remained, but it was now conducted through late-night phone calls and the sporadic weeks he was back in town, when he would appear at my door, exhausted and looking for an anchor. I was his one point of stability in a life of constant motion. He was my one link to a world outside the quiet confines of my own making. The catalyst was a project he'd been pouring his life into for nearly a year. It was a massive, complex software integration for a major financial firm, a deal that would have been a career-defining victory. He spoke about it with a feverish intensity, the long hours and high stakes fueling him. I heard the pride in his voice, but I also heard the brittle edge of exhaustion beneath it. He was running on fumes, pushing himself far beyond any reasonable limit. And then, one Tuesday in November, the whole thing fell apart. A competitor had swooped in at the 11th hour with a cheaper, albeit inferior, product. The client backed out. A year of work, of sleepless nights and missed weekends, vanished into thin air. He didn't call. He just showed up. It was nearly 2 in the morning when my buzzer shrieked, a violent, jarring sound in the stillness of my apartment. I knew it was him before I even pressed the talk button. I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and hollowed out under the harsh fluorescent light. He was wearing the suit he'd probably had on for 16 hours, the tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked utterly defeated, like a ship that had been battered by a storm and barely made it back to port. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his eyes wide with a kind of silent, desperate plea. "Come in," I said softly, stepping back to let him pass. He walked into my living room and stood in the center of the rug, looking lost, as if he'd forgotten how to operate his own limbs. He was still holding his briefcase. I gently took it from his hand and set it by the door. I took his suit jacket, which felt heavy and damp with the city's misty chill, and hung it up. He just watched me, his movements slow and disconnected. I expected an explosion, a rant, a detailed breakdown of the betrayal and the failure. Instead, there was only a profound and heavy silence. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He shook his head, a small, tired gesture. "No, not yet. Can I just stay here tonight?" I don't think I can stand being in my own place. His apartment, I knew, was a sterile, modern space that he rarely spent enough time in to feel like a home. It was a place to store his things between trips. My apartment, cluttered with books and camera equipment and the lingering smell of fixer, was where he came to feel human again. "Of course," I said. "You never have to ask," he nodded, but didn't move toward the guest room. He just sank onto the edge of my sofa, dropping his head into his hands. His sigh was a sound of such profound weariness it seemed to be dredged up from the very bottom of his soul. I left him there for a moment and went to the kitchen to make him some tea, the simple, mundane act of boiling water a small anchor in the uncertain waters of his distress. When I came back, he hadn't moved. I set the mug on the coffee table beside him. He didn't seem to notice. I sat down not next to him, but in the armchair across the room, giving him the space I thought he needed. We sat like that for a long time, in a silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. He didn't drink the tea. He just sat there, folded in on himself, a fortress of misery. Finally, I couldn't bear the distance. I moved from the chair to the sofa, leaving a careful, respectable cushion of space between us. I didn't say anything. I just sat with him in his silence. After what felt like an eternity, he stirred. He lifted his head from his hands and turned to look at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying, but from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at the space between us, that carefully maintained buffer zone, and then he just erased it. He leaned sideways, slowly, deliberately, until his head was resting on my shoulder. The same shoulder he would claim in his sleep months later. But this time, he was wide awake. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the opposite wall. My body went rigid. This was new. This was a conscious choice. This was not the casual, accidental contact of a crowded bar or a shared car ride. This was a direct, unambiguous act of seeking comfort. The weight of his head was immense, freighted with all the unspoken failure and exhaustion he couldn't bring himself to articulate. I felt the rough stubble of his cheek against the cotton of my t-shirt. I could feel the warmth of his breath. My heart began its familiar, frantic drumming, but I forced myself to remain still. I slowly, tentatively, lifted my arm and wrapped it around his shoulders, pulling him just slightly closer. He let out another long, shuddering sigh, and this time, it sounded less like despair and more like release. He burrowed into my side, nuzzling his face against my neck like a child seeking shelter from a storm. And in that moment, I felt the carefully constructed walls of my fortress begin to crack. He wasn't just seeking a safe harbor anymore. He was asking to be held. And I, the vigilant guard of our friendship's borders, was letting him in. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. It was the unacknowledged inauguration of a new phase in our relationship, a silent agreement forged in exhaustion and desperation. Julian's life didn't get easier. The failed project was a significant blow, and he threw himself back into his work with a punishing ferocity, determined to claw his way back. His travel schedule became even more relentless. But now, his time back in town had a new, unspoken purpose. My apartment became his official decompression chamber. He'd text me from the tarmac at JFK or from a cab stuck in crosstown traffic. Just landed. Mind if I crash? Too wiped to even think about my place, it was never a question. It was a statement of intent. And I always said yes. The ritual always started the same way. He'd arrive late, shed his travel persona at the door, the suit jacket, the briefcase, the weary tension in his shoulders, and emerge as just Julian, tired and in need of stillness. We would order takeout, talk about his trip in vague, impersonal terms, and then, inevitably, we would migrate to the couch to watch a movie. The movie was always incidental, a piece of background scenery for the real event. In the beginning, he would maintain the pretense. He'd sit at his end of the sofa, I at mine. But the gravitational pull between us was a palpable force. As the film wore on, he would begin the slow, incremental migration across the cushions. It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. A yawn and a stretch that ended with his arm draped along the back of the sofa, his fingers inches from my shoulder. A gradual slump, as if succumbing to an overwhelming wave of sleep that would bring his side flush against mine. And finally, the surrender, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. For weeks, this was the boundary. He would sleep, and I would sit, a statue of tense, silent devotion, my body a furnace of unspoken want. I studied his sleeping face in the flickering light of the television, the way his long lashes rested against his cheek, the slight parting of his lips. I was a cartographer mapping a beloved, forbidden land. I learned the rhythm of his sleep. I learned that the soft sigh he'd let out when he first settled against me was a sound of contentment, not unconsciousness. I knew he wasn't truly asleep, not always. There were times his breathing would catch when I shifted my weight, or his fingers would twitch against the back of the couch when a tense scene played out on screen. He was awake. He was aware. And he was choosing to be there, in that space, with me. The knowledge was a terrifying, exhilarating secret we shared without ever speaking a word of it. My internal world during these evenings was a raging tempest beneath a placid surface. My mind would race, cataloging every detail, every subtle shift, trying to assemble them into a coherent narrative. Was this just what friends did? I had no frame of reference. My other friendships were cordial, distant things. Julian was my only data point for this kind of intimacy, and the data was confusing, contradictory, and deeply intoxicating. I would imagine 1,000 different scenarios. I would imagine him waking up, pulling back in horror, the friendship shattering into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. I would imagine him waking up, looking at me, and leaning in to close the final, infinitesimal gap between our lips. Both possibilities felt equally real, equally terrifying. The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my skin, but it was overshadowed by the profound, aching tenderness I felt for him. To be the person he chose to be this vulnerable with, even under a thin veil of pretense, felt like the greatest honor of my life. Then, one night, he escalated the ritual. He'd had a particularly brutal week in Chicago, a series of marathon meetings that had left him frayed and hollow-eyed. He arrived at my apartment looking like a ghost. We skipped the pretense of dinner and went straight to the couch. He didn't even bother with the slow migration. He just sat down beside me, and after a moment, he turned, curled up, and laid his head directly in my lap. Just like that. No preamble. No feigned sleepiness. He just did it. My entire body froze. My lap. This was not a shoulder. This was not an accidental, sleepy lean. This was a deliberate, conscious act of surrender. He was lying on his side, his back to the television, his face turned towards my stomach. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. I sat there for what felt like a full 10 minutes, my hands hovering uselessly in the air, my mind a blank screen of static. I could feel the warmth of his breath through my shirt. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. Every rational thought had fled my brain, replaced by a single, overwhelming impulse. My hand moved, seemingly of its own accord. It was the riskiest thing I had ever done. I lowered it slowly, tentatively, until my fingers brushed against his hair. It was soft, thick. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, I felt him press his head, just slightly, into my touch. It was all the permission I needed. I began to run my fingers through his hair, a slow, steady, rhythmic motion. I combed through the tangles, massaged his scalp, traced the line of his hairline. And with every stroke, I felt the tension bleed out of him. His body, which had been coiled tight with stress, went limp. His breathing deepened. This time, I knew he was truly falling asleep. The sound of his quiet, even breaths filled the room. This became the new ritual. The head in the lap, my fingers in his hair. It was a given, an unspoken contract. He would come home from his travels, broken and weary, and I would let him rest. I would put him back together with quiet touches and shared silence. I was his healer, his charging station. The photography metaphor I had always used to understand the world began to feel more apt than ever. I was in a darkroom with him, in the quiet, intimate space of my living room. I was tending to a fragile, developing image, giving it the time and the gentle chemistry it needed to become clear. I was watching something beautiful and terrifying emerge, and I didn't dare rush the process. I would just sit for hours, my legs going numb beneath his weight, my hand gently stroking his hair, and I would feel a sense of purpose, of rightness, that I had never known before. The door to the guest room became another symbol in our silent play. When he stayed the night, he used to close it firmly. A clear boundary. My space, your space. But after the ritual began, he started leaving it ajar. Just a crack, a sliver of darkness that was different from the solid black of a closed door. It was an invitation. I knew it was. Or, I tortured myself into believing it was. Some nights, I would wake up and find myself standing in the hallway, just looking at that thin slice of opening. I could hear him breathing, sometimes turning over in his sleep. My heart would pound in my chest, a frantic Morse code of longing and fear. Go to him. The thought was a whisper, a temptation. He wants you there. But the fear was always stronger. The fear of being wrong. The fear of misreading the signal and causing a catastrophe. What if I walked in and he woke up, confused and alarmed? What if it was just a door, left open by a tired man who had forgotten to close it? The ambiguity was a form of torture. So I would stand there, my hand on my own doorknob, caught in that liminal space, that hallway between what was and what could be. And then, defeated, I would retreat back into my own room, the unanswered question of the open door hanging in the silent air between us. It was a threshold I was too terrified to cross. I was waiting for him to not just open the door, but to stand in the doorway and call my name. The night everything changed began like any other. It was a Thursday in late spring, the kind of evening where the air coming through the open window was soft and smelled of damp earth and blooming things. Julian had been home for 3 days, a record stretch, and a fragile sense of normalcy had settled over us. He seemed lighter, less haunted by the ghosts of his work. We had spent the day wandering through the city, I with my camera, he with nothing but time. It felt less like a recovery session and more like the easy companionship of our college days. The easy rhythm of it all had lulled me into a dangerous state of hope. The tension of the ritual had softened, replaced by a comfortable, domestic intimacy that felt both wonderful and profoundly precarious. That evening, we found ourselves on the couch, a nature documentary about deep ocean life playing on the screen. The fathomless, dark world of the abyss felt strangely appropriate, a mirror of the unspoken depths between us. As was now custom, Julian was lying with his head in my lap, his body a warm, solid weight that had become as familiar to me as my own. I was stroking his hair, my fingers tracing lazy circles on his scalp, the repetitive motion a kind of meditation. The narrator's voice droned on about bioluminescent creatures and the crushing pressure of the deep sea. I felt Julian's breathing, slow and even against my leg, and I assumed he was asleep. I let my guard down, allowing myself to look at him fully, my gaze tracing the curve of his ear, the strong line of his jaw. A wave of affection, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over me. It was a dangerous indulgence, this open admiration, but in the presumed safety of his sleep, I allowed it. The documentary ended. The screen went black, and the room was plunged into a deeper darkness, broken only by the ambient glow of the city outside. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. The sudden silence felt loud, charged. The black screen of the television reflected a distorted image of us, a dark, abstract sculpture of two figures intertwined. I should have moved. I should have suggested it was time for bed, but I was paralyzed, caught in the quiet beauty of the moment. My hand had stilled in his hair. I waited for him to stir, to wake up, and begin the awkward process of untangling himself and retreating to the guest room with the perpetually open door. He didn't move. A minute passed, then another. The silence stretched, becoming thin and taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. I could feel my own heart begin to accelerate, the familiar panic returning. Something was different. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Leo?" His voice was a low murmur, barely disturbing the stillness of the room. It was not the groggy, sleep-filled voice of someone just waking up. It was clear, quiet, and utterly awake. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body went rigid. My hand, still resting in his hair, felt like it was made of lead. "Yeah." I managed to reply, my own voice tight and strained, a stranger's voice. He was silent for another long moment. I could feel his stillness, the controlled way he was breathing. He wasn't just awake. He had been awake for a long time. He had been lying here, letting me touch him, letting me watch him, fully conscious. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The pretense was gone. The veil had been lifted. We were no longer participating in a play. We were just two men on a couch in a dark room, and the space between us was electric. "You know I'm not asleep, right?" he asked, his voice still a whisper, but now it was laced with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The question hung in the air between us. It was not an accusation. It was a confession. It was an admission of his role in our long, silent charade. He was laying his cards on the table, and it was my turn to play. I couldn't speak. My throat was closed tight. The truth I had so desperately policed, the secret I had guarded for years, was now out in the open, staring back at me. All I could do was give the slightest, almost imperceptible nod, a movement he must have felt more than seen. He shifted then, pushing himself up slowly, deliberately. He moved with a kind of careful grace, unwinding himself from my lap until he was sitting up, facing me on the couch. In the dim light from the window, I could just make out the shape of him, the dark silhouette of his shoulders, the intense focus of his gaze. He was so close. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The air crackled. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the few inches of space separating our knees. He lifted a hand, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to touch my face. Instead, his fingers just hovered in the space between us, trembling slightly. "Would it?" he began, his voice cracking on the word. He swallowed, and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was the bravest thing I had ever heard. It was not a demand. It was not a confident move. It was a plea. It was a question freighted with years of unspoken feelings, of confusion, of fear, and of a desperate, burgeoning hope. He was giving me the power. He was handing me the key to the final door, allowing me to choose whether to open it or to lock it forever. In that moment, all my fear, all my carefully constructed defenses dissolved. There was only him, his terrifying vulnerability mirroring my own. I couldn't find my voice to say yes. The word was trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. So I just nodded again, a more definite movement this time. A clear and unequivocal yes. A wave of relief seemed to wash over him, visible even in the dark as his shoulders relaxed. He leaned in, closing the final distance between us with an agonizing slowness. It was not the passionate, desperate kiss of movies. It was something far more profound. His lips met mine with a gentle, hesitant pressure. It was a question. It was a discovery. It was soft and tentative and tasted faintly of salt and the tea we'd had hours ago. I brought my hand up, the one that had been frozen in his hair, and cupped the side of his face, my thumb stroking his cheek. He sighed into the kiss, a sound of surrender, of coming home. It was a kiss that didn't take, it gave. And in that quiet, gentle moment, in the deep ocean darkness of my living room, the world tilted on its axis, and everything, absolutely everything, was new. The beautiful, fragile dawn that followed our kiss was shattered by silence. I woke up alone. The sun was streaming through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but the apartment felt cold, empty. The spot beside me on the couch was vacant, the cushions still holding the faint impression of his body, a ghost of the night before. I sat up, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I had fallen asleep on the couch, my head eventually finding its way to his shoulder, a reversal of our usual roles. I remembered the feeling of his arm around me, the solid, comforting weight of it. I remembered drifting off to a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any I had known, feeling utterly, completely safe. Now, that safety was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing dread. I called his name, my voice rough with sleep. Julian. Only silence answered. I walked to the guest room. The door, which had been the subject of so much of my internal torment, was wide open. The bed was neatly made, untouched. He hadn't slept there. He hadn't slept in my bed either. He had simply vanished. My heart sank. I found my phone on the coffee table, right where I'd left it. There was one new message, sent at 5:17 a.m. From him. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Had to catch an early flight. Last-minute thing. Talk soon. That was it. For curt, impersonal sentences. No mention of the kiss. No mention of the hours we'd spent holding each other in the dark. Talk soon. The words were a flimsy shield, a cowardly deferral. The warmth and vulnerability of the night before might as well have been a dream. I read the message again and again, the words blurring through a sudden, hot film of tears. I felt like a fool, an utter and complete idiot. I had let myself believe. For a few precious hours, I had allowed the carefully constructed fortress around my heart to crumble, and the moment I did, he had fled. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The silence from his end was deafening. Talk soon turned into a day, then 3, then a week. My attempts at communication were met with a chilling brevity. I'd send a text asking how his trip was going, and hours later I'd receive a one-word reply. Fine, or busy. The vibrant, intimate connection we had shared had been severed, replaced by the sterile, functional communication of distant acquaintances. The ritual was broken. The apartment, once my sanctuary and our shared haven, now felt like a tomb. Every corner of it was haunted by his absence. The couch was a monument to my own stupidity. I couldn't even look at it without feeling a fresh wave of humiliation and grief. My mind became a torture chamber of self-recrimination. I replayed the kiss, the question that preceded it, over and over again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? I had interpreted it as a sign of his vulnerability, his respect for me. Now, it sounded completely different in my head. It sounded like someone asking for permission to commit a transgression, a moment of weakness or curiosity he now profoundly regretted. Maybe that's all it was. A drunken impulse, but without the alcohol. Maybe his work life had been so stressful, his emotional life so barren, that he had reached for the closest, safest source of comfort, me, and had gone too far. Maybe he was straight, and this was just a confusing, momentary lapse he was now desperately trying to erase. The thought that I had been nothing more than a convenient, temporary solace was a shard of ice in my gut. The pain of unrequited love I had managed for years was nothing compared to the agony of love that was offered and then, just as quickly, rescinded. After 10 days of this agonizing silence, something in me snapped. The quiet, patient observer had reached his limit. The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating away at my sanity. I would rather have the brutal, clean pain of rejection than this slow death by 1,000 unanswered questions. I was in my darkroom, trying to work, but my hands were shaking too much to handle the prints properly. I saw his face in every developing image. I slammed the door, strode into the living room, and grabbed my phone. I dialed his number, my thumb jabbing at the screen. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He was going to send me to voicemail. I knew it. Hello. His voice was wary, distracted. I could hear the clatter of a keyboard in the background. We need to talk, I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. Leo? Hey, I can't right now. I'm in the middle of something. No. I cut him off, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. Not later. Not soon now, Julian. We need to talk now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him sigh, a sound of weary resignation, not the contented release I knew so well. Leo, I'm really sorry. I've just been swamped. Stop, I said, my voice beginning to tremble with a rage born of hurt. Just stop lying. Stop hiding behind your work. You kissed me. You held me. And then you ran away like a thief in the night and have been treating me like a stranger ever since. I deserve more than that. Our friendship, at the very least, deserves more than that. So you can either talk to me now, or I swear to God, I will get in my car and drive to your apartment, and we will have this conversation on your doorstep. The silence that followed was absolute. I had never spoken to him like that before. I had never made a demand of him in our entire friendship. I had always been the patient one, the understanding one. The receiver, not the transmitter. I heard him take a shaky breath. Okay, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Okay, Leo. You're right. I'm sorry, he sounded small, broken. Can you come over? The drive to his apartment was a blur of traffic lights and raw nerves. By the time I arrived, my anger had evaporated, leaving behind only a profound, aching sadness. He opened the door before I could knock. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same clothes he'd probably been in for 2 days. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his apartment was a mess of takeout containers and scattered papers. The successful, confident consultant was gone, replaced by a man who looked completely lost. He just stood there in the doorway, looking at me, his eyes filled with a miserable cocktail of guilt and fear. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I'm such a coward. He stepped back and I walked inside. He didn't offer me a seat. We just stood in the middle of his cold, impersonal living room, the space between us feeling like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. I just need to understand, Julian, I said, my voice softer now. What happened? He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure anxiety. I don't know, he mumbled. I freaked out. Freaked out about what? About kissing me. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. About everything. About what it meant. Leo, I've never. That's not who I am. Who you are? I asked, a fresh wave of pain hitting me. So what was all that? The last few months? Lying in my lap, letting me hold you. Was that all just some experiment? No, he said, the word exploding out of him. God, no. It wasn't an experiment. It was the only real thing in my life. You. Being with you, in your apartment. It was the only time I felt like I could breathe. My whole life is this. This performance. I'm the confident guy who closes the deal, the fun guy who's always up for a drink. It's all bullshit. It's exhausting. And when I'm with you, I don't have to be any of that. I can just be tired. I can just be. He started pacing, his words coming faster now, a torrent of confession. I didn't even realize what was happening at first. I just knew I needed to be near you, that your quiet was the only thing that could silence the noise in my own head. So I just kept coming back. And the closer I got, the more I needed. Lying on your couch. It started as just needing to shut my brain off. But then, it wasn't. I wasn't asleep, Leo. Not most of the time. I was just lying there, feeling you stroking my hair, and it was. It was the most peaceful I have ever felt in my entire life. And it terrified me. He stopped in front of me, his face a mask of anguish. Because I started to realize I didn't just want the peace. I wanted you. I wanted to know what your lips felt like. I wanted to know what it would be like to not pretend to be asleep. And the night I kissed you, it was real. It was so real. And the next morning, I woke up and I saw you sleeping there, and you looked so peaceful. And all I could think was, I'm going to ruin this. I'm going to ruin him. I don't know how to do this, Leo. I've only ever been with women. I don't know what this feeling is, but it's bigger than anything I've ever felt, and it scares the hell out of me. So I ran. Because I was afraid of destroying the one good thing in my life. Our friendship. He finally stopped, his chest heaving, his confession hanging in the air between us. He was looking at me, his eyes wide and wet with unshed tears, waiting for my judgment. And in that moment, all my hurt, all my anger, dissolved into an overwhelming wave of empathy. He wasn't a coward who had rejected me. He was a man terrified of a feeling so new and powerful it had upended his entire understanding of himself. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. The silence in Julian's sterile apartment was no longer a void of absence, but a space waiting to be filled. He stood before me, completely undone, having laid bare all his fear and confusion. He had handed me the jagged, broken pieces of his heart and was waiting to see if I would cut myself on them or help him put them back together. I looked at him, at this man I had loved in silence for so long, and I saw not the source of my pain, but a reflection of my own vulnerability. I had been terrified of risking our friendship for the hope of something more, and he, in his own chaotic way, had been terrified of the exact same thing. We were just two people, frightened of the same beautiful, terrifying possibility. I closed the small distance between us. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were cold, and they trembled in mine. I gave his hand a soft squeeze, a simple, physical reassurance that was more powerful than any words I could have offered. He looked down at our joined hands, and then back up at my face, his expression one of dawning, fragile hope. You're not going to ruin anything, I said softly, my voice steady for the first time in days. We're not that fragile. You and me. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo, that's okay. I replied, my thumb stroking the back of his hand. Neither do I. But maybe we can figure it out together. At our own pace. No more running. He nodded, his eyes shining. No more running. He repeated, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed my hand back, a silent, binding promise. We didn't stay at his apartment. It was a place of anxiety and isolation. We went back to mine, back to our space. The moment we walked through the door, I felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate. This was his safe harbor, and now, finally, he knew he didn't have to pretend to be shipwrecked to be allowed inside. That evening, we didn't turn on the television. We sat on the couch, but we didn't fall into the old ritual. Instead, we talked. For hours. He told me about the loneliness of his travels, the pressure to be constantly on, the feeling of being a stranger everywhere, including in his own life. I told him about the years of quiet observation, about the photo I took at the soccer game, about the fear that had kept me silent for so long. We were developing the image together, finally speaking the truth in the quiet sanctuary of the dark room we had built. Later, as the night deepened, a new, comfortable quiet settled between us. We were sitting close, our shoulders and legs pressed together. There was no pretense, no ambiguity, just a shared, intentional closeness. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and this time, it was not a surrender to exhaustion, but a simple, open gesture of affection. I wrapped my arm around him, and it felt natural, right? I'm so tired, he murmured against my neck, his voice soft. Then let's go to bed, I said. It wasn't a suggestion for him to go to the guest room. It was an invitation. He lifted his head and looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just smiled, stood up, and held out my hand. He took it without hesitation. That night, the guest room door stayed firmly closed. He slept in my bed, curled against my side, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm that was no longer a secret to be decoded, but a song I was finally allowed to be a part of. The peace was absolute. In the weeks and months that followed, we built our new normal. It was a quiet, gentle process of discovery. The grand, passionate gestures of romance were not our language. Our love was expressed in the small, domestic intimacies. It was in the way he'd wrap his arms around my waist from behind while I was making coffee in the morning, resting his chin on my shoulder. It was in the way I'd bring him a blanket when he was working late on his laptop on the couch. It was in the quiet hand-holding as we walked through the city, a simple, public declaration that needed no explanation. He learned to be still, and I learned to speak. He started traveling less, rearranging his work life to prioritize being home, being with me. My apartment, once just my space, became our home. There are moments that define us, not by their sound and fury, but by their profound and honest silence. The story of us was never going to be a grand narrative, a sweeping epic. It was always a collection of quiet vignettes, of unspoken understandings, of a shared glance across a room. It was the weight of a head on a shoulder, the question in a whisper, the courage to be vulnerable. We had spent so long on opposite sides of a threshold, afraid to cross, not realizing that the door was never locked. We just needed to find the courage to turn the handle together. Our life wasn't a perfectly composed photograph, a single, flawless moment frozen in time. It was the entire, messy, beautiful process of developing it. The patient waiting in the dark, the gentle chemistry of trust and time, and the slow, miraculous emergence of an image, clearer and more true than anything you could have ever imagined. We had learned to create our own light, and we had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to build together.